My name is Patrick Holford. I started out as a psychologist and have spent the last 30 years focusing on the effect of nutrition on mental health. I'm going to talk about the feel-good factor, 10 proven ways to boost your mood. I'm going to be talking about the effect of specific nutrients like omega-3s, vitamin D, B vitamins, how to get your brain's neurotransmitters really firing right, and basically how to get your clients optimally nourished, because then they will respond as best as possible to the good work that you do. Thank you very much for inviting me, and particularly because we need this sort of cross-discipline exchange. I remember I'm in my 50s, back in the 1970s, there was the mind, body, spirit. And these are three really important parts. And I was just amazed and interested and intrigued in the incredible power of the mind. And for that reason, I studied psychology and all sorts of different approaches to life. And, but when I got involved in studying schizophrenia, which was a real focus because of its terrible source of suffering, it soon became clear that psychotherapy was actually not that effective, even though that was very much where I was heading. And the drugs were not effective. I mean, they might stop someone harming themselves, but they were not curing anything. And I'm now a sort of young undergraduate looking at the research, and I came across this research out of Canada, which was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial that had given very large amounts of certain B vitamins versus placebo. And the results were exceptional. And the study was very, very well done. So I jumped on a plane and I went to meet the researcher, a man called Dr. Abram Hoffer. And I said, how many people have you treated? By the way, this was the first ever double-blind controlled trial in the history of psychiatry. I said, how many people have you treated using this megavitamin approach? And he said, over 3,000. And I said, what is your success rate? He said, 85% cure. And I nearly fell off my chair because I'd never seen a schizophrenic cured. So I said, what do you mean by cure? And he said, able to socialize with family and friends, free of symptoms and paying income tax. And that I had never seen. So I said, can I become your student? And that's really where my interest in nutrition came in. So here we are in the 21st century. We should be, wealthier and happier, but we're not. We're very unhappy. In America, 10% of the population have been given antidepressant drugs. It's probably not far off that in this country. Every year, the number of prescriptions go up and up. We did a survey on over 55,000 people. And most people talk about feeling impatient, having mood swings, feeling apathetic, suffering from depression and stress and insomnia and so on. As one child said in an exam, howler, modern man is a knackered ape, should have been naked ape. And about 15 years ago, we set up a treatment center in Richmond called the Brain Bio Center. And we have a team of psychiatrists and nutritionists. And we treat people with mental health problems, from schizophrenia down to kids with ADHD, depression, insomnia, and so on. And we actually get very good results. And this, by the way, is part of our charity, which is called the Food for the Brain Foundation. And I just want to share one quick film to kind of put it into context.
Hi, my name's Eddie Mullen. I'm 26 from Northern Ireland, and 3 years ago I was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. I was really suspicious and paranoid of other people, to the point where I couldn't work any longer. I couldn't interact with my family and friends at all. I became really socially withdrawn. My quality of life was just at the bottom. I couldn't do anything that I wanted to do, and therefore they put me on a lot of psychiatric medication, like aripiprazole, the antipsychotic, escitalopram, the antidepressant, and also buspirone for anti-anxiety, diazepam, sleeping medication, and some medications that were to treat the side effects of the medication, like procyclidine. I was on that as well for muscle rigidity. And none of these drugs actually worked for me in any way. I felt worse. I was more anxious. I was more physically ill. I put on a lot of weight. I put on about 10 stone in the period of a year and a half. And then whenever I came across Patrick's work and I started to adapt my lifestyle accordingly, I took an interest in nutrition. I bettered my diet and bettered my lifestyle, and I'm now medication free. I have a really, really good quality of life now. I lost in the last 14 months about 8 stone, and I'm now doing a business course to try and help me set up exercise classes so that I can help other people in the same situation as me. And a lot of that is down to understanding better what way nutrition affects both my body and my brain, and not being on the medication that was affecting me so negatively. And I just have been given a new lease of life, and I'm really, really thankful for that.
So what we found at our clinic, which is a nutritional clinic, so that's what we focus on, is that these are the factors that most commonly occur in people who are suffering from depression, anxiety, and so on. Blood sugar problems, hormonal problems, particularly the thyroid, lack of omega-3s, the need to increase certain amino acids that raise serotonin, sleeping problems, B vitamins that affect methylation. I'm going to go through all these. There are positive effects of exercise and vitamin D. Sometimes allergies is involved. And of course, there is the very important psychological issues, stress issues, and so on. But I think that your clients will respond much better to what you do if they are optimally nourished. Now, the actual diagnosis, often when I travel around the world, people say, does it work for clinical depression? In a lot of countries, there's this word clinical depression. And what is clinical depression? Well, actually, depression is usually diagnosed on a scale, and the most used one is the Hamilton Rating Scale. And it's a number of questions that you tick the boxes, and if you tick enough boxes, you have clinical depression, either mild or moderate or severe. And these are the kind of questions you will be asked. And the reason I'm showing you this is I want to look at a number of different approaches based on the research on the Hamilton Rating Scale. So we are looking at the same basis. I'm going to propose to you that the reason we don't feel so great is that we don't eat what we, as a species, are designed to eat. We've evolved over millions of years. We have the physiology of a hunter-gatherer. We don't take the exercise to hunt food anymore. It hunts us instead. And it's not the genes that have changed. The genes are just the same as they've always been. It's the environment that we expose our genes to. Tomorrow I'll be in Dubai teaching in sixth form schools where in one school out of 1,000 kids, 160 has diabetes. This is not caused by genes. This is caused by changing the environment to which we bathe our genes. We now have over 100,000 people who've completed a free health check on my website. This is one of the biggest health and diet surveys in the world. And I encourage you to do it. patrickholford.com is the website. And when you do it, you'll get information for yourself, but we get information for research. And basically, you get a health score out of 100%. And if you're over 80%, you're in pretty good nick. And we call that in the green. And if you're down below the 50s, then you're in the red. So we've been able to look at all this data and ask questions like, what is your chances of being in the green in an optimum health based on sugar snack consumption? And as you can see in this chart here, the more sugar snacks you have, the lower is your chance of being in optimum health. And the more sugar snacks you have, the greater is your chance of being in poor health. So, we've done a lot of analysis, and this is a heat map where we can look at a number of different factors. So we could look at mind and mood and see which foods predict poor mental health and which foods predict good mental health. And these foods like nuts, seeds, fruit, veg, oily fish, water, and so on, these are very, very consistent with our evolution. The weakest negatives is meat. It's a little bit negative. I don't think there's anything specifically wrong with meat. It's just that we eat fake meat. We don't eat fit meat. So if you go back to the 1970s, the average chicken had 9 grams of fat in it. The average chicken today has 23 grams of fat, and the average organic chicken has 20 grams of fat. And that's because these animals aren't running around like they do in the wild. So I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with meat. Interestingly, alcohol doesn't really predict poor health until you're kind of up to large quantities. And there may even be, in a number of disease areas, including Alzheimer's and heart disease, a small amount of alcohol actually predicts a lower risk than abstaining. And although this is absolutely not proven yet, I have a sneaking feeling that the stress-reducing effects of a glass of wine in the evening may actually be greater because of the tremendous negative effects of stress hormones like cortisol. That is a theory that's not proven. So you can kind of get the sense of the foods that are likely to lead someone into poor mental health. And the first I want to talk about is sugar and the effects on blood sugar. We crave sugar. That's the nature of Homo sapiens. And when we eat bread or pasta or fruit or cereal, we digest it down into glucose. So the blood glucose level goes up. And when your blood glucose level goes up, you produce a hormone insulin that grabs the glucose and dumps it into the liver, which then turns it into fat. Insulin is the fat-storing hormone. It takes excess sugar out of the blood into storage as fat. Then your blood sugar goes low. And when your blood sugar goes very low, and by the way, after a big intake of sugar, you get a rebound real low, you then produce more adrenal hormones, which get you ready to hunt. So you're basically programmed to hunt when your blood sugar is low, when you are hungry. And it makes you irritable, anxious, aggressive, pessimistic, moody, and hungry. And you start hunting for sugar. And sometimes you may hunt for caffeine, because caffeine also has an effect on your blood sugar. And this shift in blood sugar is connected to so many of today's health problems, which in medical terms are called metabolic syndrome, but I call it internal global warming. And here you are driving along in your car and a red light starts flashing. What do? Stop, get out some black tape, stick it over the light and keep driving. No, you get out the manual, you try to learn what's going on. But the kind of thinking we have today is, if your cholesterol is high, you take a statin. If your blood pressure is high, you take a pill for that. If your mood is poor, you take a pill for that. If you can't sleep, you take a pill for that. We have a 5-a-day policy in Britain. That is, by the time you're 65, the average person is on 5 medications a day. But really what you need to change is the fundamental shift underneath, and that is called metabolic syndrome. And by the way, if you have metabolic syndrome, and 1 in 4 people over 40 do, if it's actually measured, and you're not depressed, you will be soon. That's what the research shows. And if you are depressed and you don't have metabolic syndrome, you'll have metabolic syndrome soon. That's what the research shows. So in this area, one of the golden ways to improve mood is to eat what's called a low glycemic load diet. And in order to know exactly what your lunch will do to your blood sugar, you have to know 2 things. One is how much of what you are eating is carbohydrate. And that, by the way, was what Atkins was all about. He limited the quantity of carbohydrate, which is half of the story. The other half is of the carbohydrate you are eating, how fast releasing are the sugars in it. So, for example, bananas, dates, and raisins have very fast releasing sugar, akin to white sugar. While berries, cherries, and plums have very slow releasing sugar. It's called xylose. And if you crystallize xylose, so it looks like sugar, you can have 9 teaspoons of it to have the same effect on your blood sugar as 1 teaspoon of sugar. So you have to not only know how much carbohydrate, you also have to know how fast releasing, which is the quality. Now, I'm going to cover everything I've learned 30 years in 30 minutes, so I'm going to sort of move fast. So the basic rules are, number 1, you need to eat no more than a certain number of GLs. And by the way, it's 40 GLs to lose weight, 60 to maintain it, roughly. Number 2, you always eat protein with carbohydrate. And you already know this if you think about your experience. If you are hungry and I give you an apple, does it satisfy you? Does it? Not really. I offer you another apple, you say, no thanks, I've had enough apple. But there's this niggling incompleteness. But if you had an apple with some almonds or pumpkin seeds, nut seeds or beans as protein, the effect is very different. So toast and jam is like putting rocket fuel in a Mini. You'll get a quick burst in your blood sugar, then it comes crashing down. But egg on toast, protein and carbohydrate, makes you feel much fuller for longer. And the third is to graze rather than gorge. The worst thing you can do if you're significantly underlean is wake up in the morning, look in the mirror and declare, oh my God, I'm too fat, and swear you'll never eat again. Because your blood sugar is at its lowest. And remember, a lot of people with depression wake up depressed, with a low blood sugar. So you have to do something. So you have a double espresso, which gets you going for a while. And then you pass an innocent-looking fluffy white croissant. You think that can't be much. It's 25 GLs, boring on its own. So you have 2 teaspoons of jam. That's now 35 GLs. And you haven't even got to 11 o'clock on the day that you swore you would never eat again. So you need to graze rather than gorge, which of course is part of our ancestry. It's part of our design. And I've been writing books, and we have some amazing recipe books and so on. And now what I really say is there are 3 pillars to this stool, so to speak. One is nutrition, the other is exercise, and the third and most important is actually doing it. And for that reason, we got together with a group of psychologists and coaches, and we created something called Zest for Life, which you join, and you come every week for 10 weeks, and our results have been really, truly superb. So this is probably applying some of the techniques that you know about into actually doing the things that work in relation to nutrition. For example, recently a group of GPs sent us 21 patients with metabolic syndrome, either with diabetes or heart disease. If you have an HbA1c or a glycosylated hemoglobin above 7, you have diabetes, or if you haven't, you will do soon. So these are people right there in the diabetes, heart disease, obesity, low mood, type area. And the doctor said, if you can get a 10% drop in this, it's a miracle. That will save us so much money and so much grief for these people down the track. And, everything that could have improved, only took 10 weeks. A lot of very, very successful drugs do this in 1 year, and we can do it in 10 weeks with diet. So to sort of make these rules a little bit more real, tomorrow morning when you wake up and it's breakfast, maybe you fancy cereal and fruit. That is carbohydrate. So where's the protein? There's a little protein in milk. There's actually more in soya milk because it's from a bean. And if you put some walnuts or some pumpkin seeds or some almonds, that's more protein. So you need to add protein. And again, I had scrambled egg with a bit of salmon on some rye bread this morning. So that's protein with carbohydrate. And I have a drink called Get Up and Go, which is which I have it's like a shake, which is again protein and carbohydrate. And then what does 10 GLs mean or look like? This is an empirical measure of the effect of a food on your blood sugar. I had a rather rotund gentleman approach me at one of these seminars. He said, I'm diabetic, I follow your basic principles, I'm gaining weight, answer me this, he said in a somewhat aggressive tone, which is one of the hallmarks of metabolic syndrome. And I said to him, well, what do you have for breakfast? And he said, I have oat muesli. Oats are good for you, he said. And I said, does your muesli have raisins in it? So anyone here have muesli in the morning with raisins in it, or cereal with raisins? Okay, when you get home, pour out what you normally eat, take out the raisins and count them. The average bowl has 60 raisins. As you can see, 10 raisins is 5 GLs, so 60 raisins is 30 GLs. I said, do you sweeten it with anything? He said, yes, I have a whole banana. Bananas are good for you, aren't they? So a whole banana is 15 GLs. He'd done 45 GLs on the raisins and the banana, but as he quite rightly said, eggs are good for you. Not eggs, sorry, oats. But if you had oat flakes with berries, you could eat as much as you like, and you still wouldn't exceed. So you would feel fuller for longer and have that stable blood sugar. And if you did have egg on toast, the GL is only, your blood sugar is only affected by carbohydrates. So eggs don't affect the blood sugar. So you've got 10 GLs. So, you could have some rye bread would be very good. The Scandinavian harder breads are very good. The best of all are oat cakes. And when you buy oat cakes, you want the rough ones, the ones that say rough, because it's the oat bran that contains beta-glucans that stabilizes your blood sugar. And this is what we call a soluble fiber, which basically means that if you sort of put some water in it, it goes all glucky. So porridge is the effect of soluble fibers. And it does wonderful things to you. So a bit of rough every day is what I say to my patients. When it comes to lunch, you want to split your plate in half. Half of the plate is vegetables. That's about 3 GLs. And a quarter is the starchy carbohydrates, potato, rice, pasta. So that wants to be 7 GLs. This, by the way, is for maximizing weight loss. So you don't have to be so strict if that's not a needed thing. And a quarter is protein. So that would be the amount of fish or meat that would fit into the palm of your hand, or maybe a little bit bigger if you're going for a vegetarian option like sort of tofu, beans, and so on. Now, and I'm moving just very rapid fire here just to kind of give you a framework for this. There are actually 3 nutrients that really do assist weight loss, and not just weight loss, but also mood, as you will see in a minute. And one is chromium. And chromium is very interesting because it reverses what's called insulin resistance or insulin insensitivity. It makes the insulin receptor work very, very well. And when you have more chromium, you crave less sugar. The other thing that works very well is something called HCA, which is from the tamarind fruit. And by the way, half of what we eat these days is out. So I always say, when you eat in a restaurant, choose a restaurant from the country where the people are thinnest. And Thailand is the best, because the Thai people have the least diabetes, cancer, heart disease, and so on. And they use a lot of tamarind sauce, which contains HCA, that makes it much harder for you to convert sugar into fat. And the third is an amino acid, a form of tryptophan, which is called 5-hydroxytryptophan. And I'll talk more about these because it's very, very potent on mood as well. And it basically enhances serotonin in the brain. And we know that if a person's serotonin is very high, they don't overeat, and if it's very low, they can't stop eating. So, for example, a lot of people have the experience, particularly women who are more prone to low serotonin, that when their mood is low, they crave carbohydrate. They always eat something sweet when their mood is low. There is a drug, by the way, that raises serotonin very high for about 6 hours. It's called MDMA. It's not available on the National Health Service. But if someone has this drug, they cannot eat. So this was a survey we did of people who had followed my diet, and these were the ones who did the diet only. These took multivitamin and mineral, and these took the extras, and they lost more weight. So, there's very good double-blind control evidence here. Now, one thing that's interesting in relation to mood is there's been a big shift in the pattern of it. If you go back 20, 30 years, the typical candidate for depression was an older woman who would be skinny, sleeping very lightly, eating like a sparrow, and sort of disconnected from life. So pessimistic, low, flat mood. Nowadays, we are finding that maybe half, certainly a quarter, certainly a third of people who present for depression are more likely to be younger, again, more likely to be female, but not only female, and almost the opposite, sleeping a lot, can't wake up, groggy and sleepy during the day, and craving carbohydrates, gaining weight, with a sort of a real emotional sensitivity. So, if they get rejected or something happens, they go into a deep hole. And this is called atypical depression. I had a man ring me up this week, a lovely fellow called Michael, in his 60s. And basically, cut a long story short, he was suicidally depressed, terribly depressed, no motivation, real problems sleeping, sleepy throughout the day. And he'd been tried on 2 different antidepressants, and neither had really made any difference. And he was in a very bad way. And his niece said, you've got to get hold of Patrick Holford's book, The Feel Good Factor, go to the health food store, buy some supplements. And off he went, and he bought some chromium, high dose, omega-3s and B vitamins. And he said, it's like an absolute miracle. 3 days later, it's all gone. Sleeping like a baby, my mood is fantastic. He said, I had an appointment with a psychotherapist a week later, and I didn't really have anything to say because I was feeling fantastic. And that was 5 months ago. He said, it's extraordinary, 3 days. Probably what he responded to was chromium, because this is a study on atypical depression, where what they did was to take people with atypical depression, measure them on the Hamilton rating scale, placebo or chromium. This is usually quite high dose chromium, 500 micrograms or more. That's way more than you would eat. And this man took 1,000 micrograms, and 60% came out of depression. 70% had a 66.6% drop in the Hamilton rating scale. To put this into context, most antidepressants in trials will reduce the Hamilton rating scale by 15%. If chromium works, it works usually within 5 days. So a very, very rapid response does occur. It doesn't work for everyone, but it works for some, and the clue is atypical depression.
Hi, my name is Eamon, and 7 months ago I was grossly overweight and unfit, and I decided to pursue a healthier lifestyle, and as part of that I discovered the GL diet, the Patrick Holford GL diet. With the help of the diet and exercise, I have managed to lose 7 stone in 7 months. The way I feel now is just completely different, just transformed my life completely. I wake up fresh and looking forward to the day and full of energy. And as I say, a lot of this I put down to the GL diet, and I can't believe how easy it is to follow, and I never feel hungry on the diet, which is probably the most surprising thing I found with the diet. And as I say, I hope to continue a healthier lifestyle and use this diet as the foundation stone of that healthier lifestyle.
So 7 stone in 7 months. And the good news for women is you've got to go out and buy a whole new wardrobe. He had low mood, he had low motivation, he had high blood pressure, he was on medication for blood pressure, his blood pressure completely normalized. So you get this sort of increase in energy, increase in motivation. Blood sugar is a critical factor. So the action for blood sugar is to follow a low GL diet. Basic supplements I will touch on later, I've already mentioned. But I wanted to at least alert you to the fact that some people respond very, very well to chromium high dose. And I give you all the studies and evidence for that in the book. Now, we're starting to talk about neurotransmitters. We produce lots and lots of neurotransmitters, which are like chemicals of communication. From our neurons, of which we have billions, when one neuron meets another, there's a gap, and across the gap pass these chemicals of communication. They are made directly from food. Everything in your body is made from food. So the goal in sort of optimum nutrition is to make enough, make sure the listening is good. So when we talk about insulin insensitivity, it's the receptor for insulin that's no longer working. And if you look close up, this could be a serotonin molecule that's going to cross the gap, dock onto a receptor site, deliver its feel-good message, and then it is recycled. And this is all drugs, I mean, you know, heroin and cocaine and so on, they actually will interfere with or mimic one of these agents. So, for example, what cocaine does is it causes a massive release of another one called dopamine, which makes you feel good, and it's a reuptake inhibitor for dopamine. And if you block the reuptake, you get more in the gap, you feel better. That's, by the way, what the SSRI antidepressants are. They are serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They block here, so you get a little bit more in the gap, so you feel better for a little while. But actually how effective these drugs truly are is starting to kind of come out of the wash. I mean, number one, they have side effects, which are quite significant, one of which is increased risk of suicide. And I recently wrote an article about suicide, and the research shows very clearly that the risk of suicide is very, very high within 10 days and very high within 30 days of starting a new antidepressant. And some people get this tremendous inner agitation which can lead to suicide. So I think it's terribly important to be aware that if someone's medication has ever changed or they are put on medication, observe them closely, you know, in the first 2, 3, 4 weeks. For some, they're fantastic, they work really well, others they don't. This man, Professor Irving Kirsch, got very suspicious about antidepressants because what he found was that virtually all antidepressants and drugs that are not antidepressants, in placebo-controlled trials, the placebos will lower the Hamilton rating scale by 50% and the drug will lower it by 65%. So there's always this 15% difference, which is enough to get your drug license. But he wondered, why is it always 15%? So he started to explore what's called the enhanced placebo effect. There's a big lie going on in sort of modern medicine or evidence-based medicine, and that is that these trials are without bias. When you are enrolled in a trial and you're told you will be on a drug or placebo, you have to also be told that if you are on the drug, there are a number of side effects that you may get, like increased sweating, disturbance in your sleep, gastrointestinal disturbances, you know, libido disturbances, et cetera, And if you look on the back of any of these antidepressants, about 25 symptoms. And in truth, I don't know how on earth you could be on one of these drugs and not know that you're on it. And the minute you guess you're on it, when they give you the Hamilton rating scale at the end of the 2 months or 3 months, and you have to tick the boxes, there's a very good chance if you think you're on the drug, you'll go, actually, I think I am feeling a bit better. I think I am a bit less anxious. So what's now happened is there have been 7 studies which have given placebos that induce side effects, similar to the drugs, and that 15% has gone away. So there is a question as to how much of that 15% is an enhanced placebo effect. Now, if there are any doctors in the audience and I'm offending you, my apologies, and anyone I don't offend, please come and see me afterwards. But you might say, well, this is nonsense because I've given patients drugs and they do respond, and that's exactly what the research shows. The research shows that if you give people antidepressants, you get a 65% response. But the question is how much of that is to do with you saying this is the right thing to do, them believing that it will help and so on, and how much is really the drug effect. Recently, last year, in the Journal of American Medical Association, there was a very good review of 6 very good studies, and it concludes that the magnitude of benefit of medication compared with placebo may be minimal or non-existent on average in patients with mild or moderate symptoms. And that is, in essence, the same advice that the UK's National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence, NICE, gives out. For severe depression, there is evidence that these works. For mild and moderate depression, the evidence is very, very flimsy. Now, if you believe that the reason these drugs work is that they raise serotonin, then from a nutritional point of view, you'd say, why am I low in serotonin? Am I low in serotonin? Number one, at our Brain Biocenter, we actually measure serotonin levels. And, we treat accordingly. The next question you might ask is, how do I raise serotonin, which I will answer in a minute. But serotonin is made from tryptophan. and specifically 5-HTP, 5-hydroxytryptophan. So you might say, well, why not give 5-HTP? By the way, if a person is low in serotonin, which is more common in women than men, women respond in a different way to stress. I mean, in essence, without sounding sexist, it looks like our biology is that men are hunter-gatherers, men are hunters, and women are gatherers. And hunters talk a different language. So men's mobile phone bills are a fraction of women's. You know, they say, Frank, I'll meet you down the pub 6 o'clock. You know, that's it. But women gather. They gather information. They talk a lot more than men. And you know, hunting used to be buffaloes. Now it's money. So a man is the provider and will be terribly depressed if they lose their job. You know, they need to provide. Gathering is shopping. Since the very beginning of recorded time, women have always had bags into which to gather the nuts and seeds and berries. and one of my theories is that it's actually pathologically impossible for a woman to leave home without a bag. So just to test this theory, are there any women here who came here without a bag? Okay, we have one. All right. So anyway, these are some of the symptoms that occur in low serotonin. So, you know, if your wife is depressed and would rather have chocolate than sex and, you know, emotionally volatile and so on, one possibility is low serotonin. So if this is a study at Oxford where they took 15 women who were not depressed, gave them shakes, you know, like milkshakes that had all nutrients needed except tryptophan. And within 8 hours, 10 of the 15 women become depressed. So everything in your body is made directly from food. This is a study, by the way, where they fed rats tryptophan and measured in their cerebrospinal fluid, which is the closest you can get to what's happening in the brain. Up goes 5-HTP, up goes serotonin. So if anyone says, yes, but these nutrients you can't make serotonin from, it's nonsense. It's a very, very direct effect. There have been 27 studies giving 5-HTP. Of those, 11 were double-blind placebo and 6 measured the Hamilton rating scale. And these are the percentages on top of placebo. So while the antidepressants score roughly a 15% improvement, these are the percentage improved on 5-HTP. So you might say, well, why aren't we prescribing 5-HTP? And it's a very good question. And I've been in this field too long to not tell you the truth, which is basically they're not profitable. You can only make significant money out of something you can patent, and you can only patent something that is man-made. And 5-HTP is a naturally occurring nutrient, so there just isn't the margin in it, and there isn't the profit in it. But it's very, very effective. We use it with great effect, especially in people we measure who are low in serotonin. And by the way, from serotonin you make melatonin, so it helps sleep as well. We usually give 100 to 300 milligrams. Occasionally someone gets a little bit of gastrointestinal sort of nausea because most of the serotonin is actually made in the gut. And we generally say don't take it if you're on an antidepressant drug, because if the antidepressant is blocking your ability to break down serotonin and now you give the nutrient to make it, you could theoretically make more. But in truth, working with our psychiatrists, we often start to phase in the 5-HTP as the antidepressant comes out. I think because of the time I will skip that, but this was a lady who was very, very depressed. And she was tried on many medications. She got to the point where she was literally collapsing, unable to walk, really not thinking straight, clearly having some very strong side effects. And all that happened was they increased the dose, changed the medication. And then one day she came across my book, and it just blew her mind because it just, you know, she said it was like reading about me. She took it to her GP, she actually took it to a psychiatrist, and he said, if you do this, I may section you. And took it to a GP who said, this makes a lot of sense, it's worth trying. So the GP supported her. She came to the Brain Biocenter. We measured her homocysteine, which is to do with B vitamins. I'll explain in a minute. It was high, that's bad news. Her vitamin D was low, her noradrenaline was low, her serotonin was low-ish, her thyroid hormone level was low. And we gave her the appropriate diet and cocktail. And to cut a long story short, 1 month later, she's feeling very good. 3 months later, she's feeling fantastic. 5 months later, she's back at work. And she was actually investigated for benefit fraud because they said, no one goes from this disability to back at work. We think you must have been cheating. And, you know, she lost several stone in weight. So what boosts serotonin? Sunlight boosts serotonin. So this is one of the reasons why people struggle more in the winter. And if you get a full spectrum light, you know, you can literally make more vitamin D. And vitamin D is worth supplementing. Very, very good studies. In the winter, we do not get enough vitamin D. We're basically designed to be naked living outdoors a lot further south than London. Exercise boosts serotonin, so exercising outdoors is very good. A low GL diet does. Chromium does. 5-HTP does. I haven't really spoken about tyrosine. It's an amino acid that helps make noradrenaline and dopamine. So often in depression, there are two sides. There's very low mood and lack of motivation. And motivation is connected more with dopamine and adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is made from tyrosine, while low mood is connected more with serotonin, made from 5-HTP. Certain cofactor nutrients that I will explain, also called methyl nutrients, omega-3s. This is a study that shows that you can predict a country's rate of depression simply by knowing intake of seafood. This is a study that shows you can predict a country's rate of murder simply by knowing intake of seafood. So Bulgaria would be a very bad choice of a place to live. Down here we have Korea, Norway, Portugal, Hong Kong, Japan, very high seafood intake, very low murder rate. And this is, we often think this is only to do with omega-3s, but it's not. Seafood is a very, very good source of B12 and what we call methyl nutrients. It's very interesting food. But basically, there are two types of essential fats. There's the omega-6 fats, which grow in a hot climate. So something like sunflower seed is omega-6. It's hot climate. And what most of us lack more of is the cold climate omega-3. So something like walnut or flax is a cold climate plant that has more omega-3. The best source of the vegetarian omega-3 is something called the chia seed, which grows in altitude in Central America. It's very nice, very tasty, and just starting to come into Britain now. And the most direct and potent are the fish oils, and these are from oily fish. So we're talking about cold water fish that eat fish. And in case you don't know, these were discovered because the Eskimos have the highest intake of fat, the highest intake of cholesterol, no heart disease. And the question is why? And the answer, it turned out to be, is that the cold water plankton in the Arctic is very high in this stuff. The little fish eat it, so they start to make this stuff. And then the fish with teeth like the salmon and mackerel eat the little fish, so they're now getting lots of this. And then the seals eat the fish with teeth, and the Eskimos eat the seals. And that's how we learned if you want to have a healthy heart and a good mood, you eat Eskimos. Or oily fish. Again, there have been 10 studies that have given EPA fish oil. It seems that it's the EPA part that's most potent antidepressant versus placebo. They haven't all worked, but there's been some very, very good results. And in 3 studies, there was a reduction in the Hamilton rating scale versus placebo of these kind of percentages. So this is another very interesting area to pursue. So a question you might, there might be some very simple questions, and actually in my book, which you're happy to pilfer, there's some very simple questionnaires, but one, you might want to know a little bit about someone's diet. Because if they eat no fish, they eat no seeds, and they're depressed, it's a clue. So action is to eat more fish, eat more seeds, possibly supplement essential fats, omega-3s. And I do that every day anyway, but if I have a patient who's depressed, I give them a real high concentrate of omega-3. Vitamin D improves your mood. There's more and more evidence coming out on that. And once again, we just don't get enough in the winter. And this is a case where the RDA, the thing you read on the cornflakes packets called the ridiculous dietary arbitrary, is just scientifically wrong. It's too low. All the experts know it's too low. So you will hear more and more and more about vitamin D in relation to many things, including mood. Exercise works. If you exercise 3 times a week, 61% halve their Hamilton rating scale. But of course, one of the big issues is if you're feeling down, you don't want to exercise. And if you've got no energy, you don't want to exercise. So generally, when people start to improve their diet, particularly eating low GL type diet, their energy goes up a lot. And now they become more motivated to exercise. And by the way, I recommend people to get out into nature. There's something, if you're really upset, go for a walk in nature. There's something about being in nature, in a natural environment, and doing some exercise that really helps to restore balance. Another factor I don't have enough time to go into is the possibility of an underactive thyroid. The thyroid gland, which is based here, stimulates metabolism. And basically, if you are the symptoms are things like depression, lethargy, loss of concentration, panic attacks, poor temperature tolerance. You feel very cold in the winter, you can't deal with the heat in the summer, you have sluggish digestion, you're gaining weight, then you might have an underactive thyroid. And if you are checked by your doctor, they test two things: the amount of thyroxine in your blood and the amount of this stuff, which is a hormone made in the brain, and it tells the thyroid to make thyroxine. So if you have a very, very high TSH, in other words, your brain is saying make more, but you have a low blood level, then you know you've got an underactive thyroid. And as I said before, tyrosine is the amino acid in this case that also makes thyroxine. And there are certain nutrients that are needed. So sometimes people are given hormones like this form of thyroxine or this form of, and so on, but there are nutrients that do help to support this. In my book, I go into this in a much more detail. One of the interesting discoveries is that at least a third of people with an underactive thyroid, if tested, test positive for what's called anti-thyroid antibodies. And that means that their immune system is attacking the cells that make thyroxine. And we know that that is very, very strongly linked to the possibility of allergy. And here we have a study, and 51% of patients are detected for antibodies of people with underactive thyroid. And one of the allergies that is linked to underactive thyroid and depression most is actually wheat allergy, the strongest version of which is called celiac disease. And 1 in 100 people have celiac disease. However, medical textbooks still say it's 1 in 2 or 3,000. That is wrong. And of people who have gastrointestinal problems, 1 in 30 has celiac disease. So there are many people with celiac disease who go undiagnosed for many, many years. And it can be a major, a single cause of depression. So if someone has a lot of inflammatory symptoms, bloating and eczema and asthma and headaches and aches and pains, especially if they come and go, they're not always there, maybe they're better when they go to a country where they eat different food, it can be indicative of an allergy. This is your inner skin. This is your digestive tract. If you were to lay your inner skin out flat, it's the size of this room, and the first layer of cells, called the epithelial cells, is no more than 1/4 of a sheet of paper thick and are replaced every 4 days. That's how regenerative your body is. That's why if you have too hot a cup of tea and you burn the inside of your mouth, within 4 days that flaky, numb feeling is gone, because you rebuild those cells very quickly. And what happens is that inner skin is very, very prone to damage. Normally inside you have billions of beneficial bacteria called probiotics. You digest your large food particles down into, for example, your proteins down to amino acids. The amino acids are allowed into the body. But if the gut starts to become damaged, then what happens is you get whole food particles through. So as nutritionists, we often give people with digestive problems digestive enzymes to make sure they're really breaking their food down. We sometimes give them beneficial bacteria, probiotics. So you'll hear more and more about that. And this again is not a proven thing, but for example, if somebody felt much more depressed after an antibiotic, you really need probiotics. So what happens is things damage the gut. Do you know what the single biggest cause of internal gut damage is? It's painkillers. Average person in Britain takes 373 painkillers. And 1/4 of people who take painkillers will take 6 in the day. So NSAIDs, ibuprofen, aspirin damage the gut. Alcohol damages the gut. Antibiotics damage the gut. Eating something like a lot of wheat gluten, especially if you're allergic to, damages the gut. Having a lot of bloating damages the gut. And if you damage the gut and you don't digest your food well, you start to develop food intolerances. And the intestines literally become more permeable. So we sort that out and we check people for allergies. This was a study back in the Lancet in the 1980s, basically a double-blind trial, and it found that when they had identified what someone was allergic to, they gave it hidden, so they didn't know they were getting it, versus placebo. And they were able to produce severe depression, nervousness, feeling of anger without a particular object, loss of motivation, severe mental blankness, just by introducing a food that someone was allergic to without them knowing. So, to make this more real, I had a patient called Liz who was schizophrenic, diagnosed at the age of 15. I met her when she was 22. She was on major antipsychotic drugs. She dropped out of school. She was obese. She had no friends, etc. She turned out simply to be wheat allergic. And on eliminating wheat, all her schizophrenia went. And within a year, she was back at university and back to a normal life. ended up happily married, 2 kids, just fine. So sometimes it's like that. One of the slight blind spots at the moment in mainstream medicine is it's understood that there is a type of antibody called an IgE antibody that causes strong allergic reactions. But there is another antibody that I hate to say is a new kid on the block because there's about 15 years of research on this, called IgG. And IgG allergies do not, if you eat the food, you don't get an immediate reaction. So you can eat something one day, react the next day. So you don't really know what it is. And we use blood tests to find out what's going on. So there's a whole lot of sort of inflammatory type symptoms. So when you meet someone, for example, who has very dark under the eyes, that is inflammation of the vascular bed. That is a very clear sign of allergy. By the way, some colleagues of mine in America went into an exclusive restaurant, observed how people wipe their nose. And at the end of the meal, they'd say, I'm from the university, I've been observing how you wipe your nose. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions? And it turns out that people who have allergies wipe their nose like this. It's called the allergic salute. The rest of us, if it's cold, we might do that, but they do this. They're always irritated. And if you do it long enough, you get a wrinkle across the top of your nose. So if you ever see an allergic wrinkle or dark marks under the eyes, you might be looking at someone who has allergies. So what we do is we take a small sample of blood and we dilute it and we put it into each of these little trays. And in these trays are food proteins. And if you've got antibodies in your blood that attack the food protein, you get a complex forms and less light gets through. So whatever it is, it's a bit like battleships, isn't it? Whatever it is that's in 2F, is an allergic reaction, strong, and in 2G, moderate, and in H1, mild. And all of these are no reactions. So you then get a chart. The laboratory we use, because they have done the most science on this, is York test, and it identifies what someone is allergic to. So sometimes allergy is playing a role in mental health. Here's an example. Peter, he was severely depressed, sometimes suicidal thoughts. He was on medication, but got a lot of unpleasant side effects. And in his case, when we eliminated foods that he reacted to, he very quickly started to feel a whole lot better, less down, huge improvement in his general well-being and mood. So sometimes allergy plays a role. Now, there is a gentleman who came up to me involved in your organization, and he actually read my first book in 1982, I think 81, when I was 23 or something. And in it, I wrote about the homocysteine theory. And today, there are 17,000 studies published on homocysteine. It's an incredibly important substance in the blood. And if your level is high, it means you are poor at a process called methylation that depends upon B vitamins. And if you've never heard of this word homocysteine, it's really important. It's quite hard to remember. Just think of Gay Chapel. If your homocysteine level is high, it predicts your risk for heart disease better than cholesterol, substantially better than cholesterol. In Germany, they run 4 million homocysteine tests a year. In Britain, we have a kind of a blind spot. The reason why women are told to take folic acid is simply because folic acid is one nutrient that improves methylation, lowers homocysteine. So in truth, a 40-year-old, your homocysteine ideally should be below 7. Above 10, you have increased brain shrinkage and bone shrinkage. A 40-year-old woman with a homocysteine of 6 has a lower risk of birth defects than a 20-year-old woman with a homocysteine of 20. So we say don't get pregnant until your homocysteine is below at least 7. It predicts Alzheimer's, it predicts depression, especially in women, predicts osteoporosis. And in a study in July in Sweden, they found that if you knew a child's homocysteine, you could predict their school grades. Just that, nothing else. Here is a study at Oxford which found that 2 in 5 people over 61 have insufficient B12 to stop accelerated brain shrinkage. 2 in 5. B12 is one of the nutrients required for methylation. The older you get, the less well you absorb it. And this is very, very important. Also included in here is data from a study which found that the lowest amount of B12 required in an older person to normalize B12 status is 500 micrograms. The RDA in Britain is 1 microgram. So, if you are, 50 plus, you don't know how well you're absorbing B12. If you measure your homocysteine, it's low, fantastic. Here was a study, you might recall this earlier this year. This is actually by the chair of our scientific advisory board. And what he did was to take people who don't have Alzheimer's dementia, They have the phase before, which is called mild cognitive impairment. And he did brain scans on them. And he measured their rate of brain shrinkage over a year in relation to the homocysteine level. And the higher the homocysteine at the start, the greater was the rate of brain shrinkage. I should explain that in an older person with no memory loss, the brain shrinks at about 0.5%. So these are accelerated brain shrinkage. What he then did was to give half of the group high-dose B vitamins designed to lower homocysteine. And that's the red group, and the other half were on placebo. And as you can see, what the vitamins did, particularly in the group with the raised homocysteine, is they more than halved the rate of brain shrinkage, actually down to what you would call normal levels. And by the way, the amount of homocysteine that predicts accelerated brain shrinkage is above 10 units. The average person over 40 has a homocysteine between 11 and 12. So it's a bit like saying that probably half of people in Britain have an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's as a consequence of lack of B vitamins. Here is one person who was in the placebo group. Their brain shrank by 2.5%. The homocysteine went up from 22 to 30, and everything you see in turquoise are brain cells that have died. This is a scan taken from the top, so the bit in the middle is not empty, it's actually the top of the spinal cord. This is a person who was given the high-dose B vitamins. Their brain shrank by 0.46%, that's kind of a normal level. The homocysteine went down from 24 to 12, and there is no turquoise, there's no visible loss of brain cells. Because of the importance of this, I remember asking Professor David Smith, how long will it be before the NHS introduce screening, early screening, because that's what we need, early screening from age 50. And he said, well, optimistically 5 years, realistically 10. 10 years equals 2 million more people with Alzheimer's. So what our charity did, Food for the Brain, is we built with the Oxford researchers the first ever free online accurate cognitive function test. Anyone can do it. We launched it this summer. 100,000 people have done it to date. So I urge you, anyone you know over 50, do this test. It's really easy. foodforthebrain.org. If your score is not good, then it gives you a letter to take to your GP, and some GPs will then measure your homocysteine. Some don't. There's a massive education gap required there. But you can get it measured yourself if you are concerned. If your homocysteine is raised, you need more B vitamins. What we, excuse some of this sort of commercial stuff, I didn't really mean it to be there. But what we do, there's a few formulas out there that contain, and they're usually called H factor, homocysteine modulators, this one is called Connect, which contain the specific nutrients that lower homocysteine. And that's what we do. If someone has a raised level, we give them more. I met a man called Chris Kruger, I wonder if he comes up next, yes, in South Africa, and he came up to me and said, I feel brain dead. I have no mood, no motivation, sex, I don't even know what it is. I keep losing my car in multi-story car parks. And his homocysteine level was 119. It's very, very high. So he took the vitamins, he changed his diet. 1 year later, his homocysteine was 9. And when I last met him, he jumped up on stage. He said, my mood, my energy is fantastic. I'm 60 years old. I wake up in the morning full of energy. I now exercise for an hour every day. My memory and concentration are better than they have ever been in my life, ever. They're fantastic. And then he started to tell me about his new young girlfriend, but I didn't want to go there. So the ways to boost your mood are balance your blood sugar, balance your hormones. I've only spoken here about thyroid, but there is a whole story to be said, particularly in men, about low testosterone levels later in life, and in women, low estrogen progesterone levels. Identify and eliminate hidden food allergies, which may play a part. Increase your intake of omega-3 fats from oily fish. Up your serotonin levels. Ideally, if you could check, with natural amino acids. We spoke about 5-HTP. Solve sleeping problems. Haven't really spoken too much about that, but sleep is absolutely vital, and insomnia is an epidemic. Improve methylation with B vitamins. Combine exercise with vitamin D. And the one thing I'm not talking about, because you know much more than I, and I haven't got enough time, and this is on nutrition, is reducing stress and solving psychological issues. Yeah. So that gives a bit of time for questions. Excellent.
I want to go back to your early reference to eating protein with carbohydrate.
Yes.
Now, You obviously know about the hair diet.
I do indeed, yes.
Which talks about
Yes.
separating the two.
Yes.
And I can actually vouch that
Yeah.
it works for weight loss, for example.
Yes, it does.
And so on.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
What's my comment on that? Back in the 1930s, there was a guy. Yeah, the question was about the hay diet, which is what you know as a food combining diet. In the 1930s, there's a very, very bright doctor who said we shouldn't eat sugar, we shouldn't cook fruits to death, we shouldn't have so much meat, we should have more vegetables and all sorts of stuff. All of which, you know, he was right, absolutely. And then he had one theory which basically came out of the flatulent effect of beans. And he developed the theory that because beans contain both protein and carbohydrate, we shouldn't be eating protein and carbohydrate together. So hence was developed the notion that you should separate your proteins from your carbohydrates. Now, I always thought it was a little bit fishy because nature doesn't do it. So oats is protein and carbohydrates, and seeds are protein and carbohydrates. You know, the only food out there that's pure protein is meat, and the only food out there that is pure carbohydrate effectively is fruit and vegetables without the nuts or seeds. We did some studies where we took people and we gave them exactly the same food, which was good food according to this diet. One bothered to separate their proteins and carbohydrates and the other didn't. Both benefited. So there's no question, if you follow the food combining diet, you lose weight. It does work. But what we showed was it wasn't really so much to do with the food separation. Now I can see that you're a man from Africa, and recently I spent a very interesting afternoon with two paleontological archaeologists who have the largest collection in the world of ancient human feces. And they have been studying our evolution. And one of the questions, from what we were eating, and one of the questions I actually asked is, were our early ancestors separating their protein and carbohydrates? In other words, did they only, they had a mono diet? Did they just eat meat here, and then fruit there? And the answer was no. From the very, very earliest fecal remains, we have been combining foods. So I think that Dr. Hay got 8 out of 10, or 9 out of 10. But that last bit I think is wrong. And nowadays, when we're in this epidemic of diabetes and obesity and heart disease, there's no question, when you put protein with carbohydrate, you slow down the release of sugars. Next question. Yes.
I have 2 questions.
I'm just going to go to this gentleman here and come to you next. Yeah.
Hi, Patrick. When the blood testing, the York testing for allergies, if you have a test and then you remove the foods for a period,
Yes.
do you then become not allergic to those things? Do the allergies change over time?
Yes,
Can you
it's
make
a very
a comment
good
there?
question that you ask. The IgE antibody that causes generally very strong reactions, it appears to last for life. So in other words, as the antibodies die off, they pass the memory on to the next generation. So it's a for life thing. But the IgG antibody lives for 3 months and doesn't pass its memory along. So let us say that I'm, milk or soya allergic, and I now avoid milk or soya. 3 months later, I will have no more IgG antibodies to milk or soya. So theoretically, probably if I've healed the gut and improved my nutrition, I can reintroduce the food and no longer react. So what happens is as people get healthier, their number of IgG reactions become less and less and less and less and less. So yes, it's not a life sentence. It's actually a process that you go through to reduce allergies. Yes, the lady with the mic.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is that on a regular basis, what vitamins and minerals do you personally take?
Yeah.
And second question is, if a hypothyroid person get proper replacement thyroxine, then the symptoms should not be there. But we see that they do have problems symptomatic.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the 2 questions. First of all, I take 3 things every day, and I recommend everyone to do it. High-strength multivitamin, twice a day. And by the way, when I mean high strength, it's got lots of Bs. One of the most deficient vitamins is vitamin D. So a good multi should have 15 micrograms of vitamin D. So if you want to know which is good, because you can spend much less money but get a tenth of the nutrients. Magnesium is incredibly important, helps sleep. And most of us are low in magnesium. So a good multi would give you 150 milligrams of magnesium. Many give you none. I take additional vitamin C, because you cannot get enough in a multi. I take at least a gram a day. Actually, I take 2, including everything that I eat. 2 grams is about 40 supermarket oranges worth. And you might think that's weird, but that's exactly what they feed the gorillas in London Zoo. And if you ask the zookeeper why they do it, it's because they'll say that's what keeps them healthy. That's what they eat in a natural wild environment. And by the way, on that topic, I just want to make 2 points. One is that if you go back 200 years, even in, for example, early Victorian age, we ate twice as much food because we expended at least 3 times as much calories. All life was exercise. And as a consequence, we burned calories, we ate more food, we had no fridges, we had no cars, so the majority of our food was fresh. And estimates, this came out of the Royal College of Health, the only way you could achieve the vitamin and mineral intake of our early ancestors, I mean not early, but our recent ancestors today would be to supplement, or run a marathon a day and eat 10 servings of fruit and veg. And then the third point I'd like to make is some people say when you take these high-dose vitamins like vitamin C, they either say you're just making expensive urine, or they say you can't absorb it. Both can't be true, because if you make expensive urine, you've absorbed it into your blood. And it always reminds me to drink water, because when you drink water, what is the fate of water? You excrete it. So should you not drink water because you excrete it? Of course not. Why not? Because it lurks in your system for about 3-4 hours. That's the same with vitamins. That's why I take them twice a day. The third I take is essential fats, omega-3s. 3 things. There are others, but that's what I take. Now, the second question was, when someone has an underactive thyroid, they are normally given thyroxine or L-troxin, which is actually what's called T4. It's not the active thyroid hormone. It's one step before the active. And there are quite a few studies that show that if you give T3, which is a natural thyroxine preparation, it works better. So this is a bit controversial. One of the medications is called Armour thyroid. So sometimes switching people onto natural T3 thyroxine works better. But as I showed you earlier, there are some nutrients that help, like tyrosine, iodine, zinc, selenium, that support that process. But I really want to stress that I think a lot of underactive thyroid kind of comes out of this whole internal global warming, metabolic syndrome, losing blood sugar control, lacking nutrients, not doing exercise, and so on. So very often when you tune those things up, it does remind me of a story, because I was at a yoga center with someone I know in this room, and this fit young girl comes up to me and she says, I'm tired all the time. And it was clear that her diet was very good, her exercise was very good. I said, check out your thyroid. Her thyroid was underactive. I said, now check for anti-thyroid antibodies. She was positive to anti-thyroid antibodies. I said, must check for allergy. And she was wheat allergic. When she eliminated wheat, her anti-thyroid antibodies vanished. Her thyroxine level returned to normal. Her energy returned to normal. So quite often, that is an area that is worth investigating. Again, details are in the book. By the way, you can get a first shot at the thyroid from just measuring body temperature. So there's a simple check that you can do with a thermometer. So, that's how it works. Next question. Who's got the mic? Yes.
Patrick.
Okay, very good.
Just to ask, my husband had a severe stroke from very high blood pressure.
Yes.
And he's on quite a lot of medication, but has done very well.
Yes.
Is it possible to take supplements? I mean, can they have contraindication with medication?
Very, very rarely I don't mean very rarely. There are very few nutrients supplemented that interfere with medication. And the two that are relevant, and one is more theoretical than proven, is the 5-HTP and antidepressants. And the other is that if your husband is on a significant blood thinner, like warfarin, Coumadin, then you have to be a bit careful about having lots of omega-3, which is also a blood thinner. Ginkgo biloba is also a blood thinner. Vitamin E is a very mild blood thinner, and so on. But it's kind of interesting, because if you know that omega-3 is a blood thinner, and you know that, I don't mean to be too rude here, but if you want to kill rats, you get warfarin. Warfarin is what you give for rat poison. And the reason is an overdose of warfarin makes the blood too thin and they get a cerebral hemorrhage. So when you've had a heart attack, you often put on a blood thinner to minimize the chance of a second heart attack. You may not need to be on that forever, but it's a very, very sensible first place. The risk of having too much of a blood thinner is that you then have cerebral hemorrhage, which is much worse. So you've got to play it a bit like this. Now, if omega-3 is a blood thinner, and it has all these other known benefits of reducing stroke and heart attack risk, you might say, well, should we be saying don't take omega-3 with a blood thinner, or should we be saying don't take a blood thinner with omega-3? So in my book on heart disease, we talk about this, and there's something you measure called the INR. So there's a measure of the, what's happening in the blood. And some cardiologists introduce more omega-3, measure the INR, and then if they're getting the result that the drug is producing, they then reduce the drug. There is a special report on how to maximize recovery from stroke on my website. Yeah. Next question. Yes.
Is it on? Oh, yeah. With increasing rates of dementia, is there any evidence to suggest diet can affect dementia? And for people with dementia, what can be done about it with diet?
Yeah. By the way, just to put this in context, dementia is what is diagnosed when you have a significant, cognitive impairment. Alzheimer's is only diagnosed when you can do a brain scan and you see this degeneration of what's called the medial temporal lobe. About 3/4 of dementia is Alzheimer's. So that, but not all dementia is, but 3/4 is. And we don't at this point know how to reverse Alzheimer's. There is some evidence that you may be able to arrest it. And a gentleman came up to me and said, actually, my dad's had dementia now for 30 years, taking all the homocysteine lowering B vitamins, haven't got worse, but probably not got better. So we don't know how to reverse, but it might be arrestable. But it is preventable. And that's the important point. I wrote a book recently called The Alzheimer's Prevention Plan, where I go through all the factors. Omega-3s make a difference, blood sugar balance makes a difference, exercise makes a difference, social interaction makes a difference. Anything that increases sort of connectivity makes a difference. But the single greatest evidence is on homocysteine lowering B vitamins. So it's not the only factor, but anyone with dementia should automatically have their homocysteine level measured. If it's above 9, let's say, then high dose B vitamins. And that's where the evidence is the strongest. Next question. Yes, where is it? Here, yes.
I'm wondering if you've got any way of identifying people who actually don't really need talk therapy and can clearly be treated with these methods alone, and something that we could know as well as therapists.
Yeah. Well, it's a little interesting. It's like the fellow who took the chromium. He took chromium, omega-3 and B vitamins, and 3 days later he was better. We don't know what it was, but probably it was the chromium. But I think that, in my books, I try to make the questionnaires really sort of doable. And the website Health Check is very, very good. So in a sense, you could do one of those questionnaires or the health check and see if someone's out of balance. And if they obviously are, they do the nutrition and see where they stand. I've seen the beginnings of studies that show that psychotherapy results are far better when people are optimally nourished. And I think that's the really interesting crossover. And I kind of came into this field in the 80s because we ran a rather controversial study, which some of you people might possibly recall. But Horizon filmed it and The Lancet published it. But we took 90 school kids, put a third on vitamins, third on placebo, a third on nothing. And we get a 3-point IQ shift in those on the placebo and a 10-point IQ shift on the vitamins. So it's interesting. We want to improve our quality of life. We want to improve our happiness. And we want to improve our children's performance at school and so on. And we'll spend a lot of time on the technology that is the psychological technology and teaching technology, but we don't really pay so much attention to the fact that the brain is made directly from nutrients. So I kind of think both are good, but if you get someone's nutrition good, it may be that they have the psychological stamina to actually work through issues, that then resolve issues. If you're knackered, I think it's very, very hard to respond. So I think the two, really complement. Thank you. Yes?
Anyone else want to put a hand up to the mic?
I think there's a gentleman right down here at the front.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Has there been any scientific research done to look at to see which
Where are you, by the way?
Sorry.
Oh, very good. Hello.
Yeah, has there been any scientific research, as far as you know, done to look at what genes are methylated before and after people have been treated with the B vitamins and the TMG?
And what genes?
Yeah, to see what genes are inactivated as a result of the methylation.
Absolutely. And the issue about genes, you may or may not be aware of this, but one of the most phenomenal new areas of medicine is epigenetics, which means the effect of the environment on genes. That your genes are like programs that can be switched on or off depending on your environmental exposure. And it turns out that the principal method of switching genes on or off is via what's called methyl switches, which is to do with all the B vitamins. So when you take the B vitamins and lower your homocysteine, it actually changes genetic expression. I'm going to cheat now and put two studies into one as if they were the same bunch of rats. But it shows you the intriguing nature of this. We know that there is, if you look at alcoholics, a significant proportion of alcoholics will contain a set of genes that mean they have less receptors for dopamine. Dopamine makes you feel good. So in other words, their biology is such that they don't feel good, and they search for ways to feel good. And one way to feel good is alcohol. So if you have a group of alcoholics and you ask them, do you remember your first drink? A significant percentage will say, do I ever? The lights came on. And if you had that sort of reaction, you'd keep drinking. Anyway, in this study, what they did was they selected pregnant rats with that, it's called the reward deficiency syndrome, with that set of genes. They fed the pregnant rats the high-dose methylating B vitamins. Their babies were born with the reward deficient gene, because that's the way it is, but switched off. So in other words, they were fine. And then this was actually a second experiment. Some of those rats were deprived of licking and grooming by the mother. So we could call it maternal caring or love. That switched the gene on. So in AA, they say hugs, not drugs. And basically what we are now learning is that hugging changes gene expression. Nutrition changes gene expression. And probably we will find that your mind frame and how you process stuff actually changes your gene expression. I just finished a book with a very brilliant medical journalist called Jerome Byrne, which is called 10 Secrets of Healthy Aging, or our code name is Surfing the Silver Tsunami. And it'll be out in April. And in that, we talk a lot about how you can switch genes away from the aging process. So I think what's happened in the field of nutrition is we realize it's far more powerful than we think. Genes do play a role, not only in physical diseases, but also in psychological behavior. But everything we do changes genetic expression. And this whole, mind-body, that's how I started sort of spirit field. Because connectivity I find really fascinating. There's some really good stuff coming up on that. It's all much more fluid than we think. It's all much more, integrated than we think. So whichever end you come in on, it affects the others. But my wish is simply to have put nutrition a little bit higher up on your radar as something that might be worth checking. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.